Father, we just thank you for this evening, and Lord, thank you for the time of worship. Lord, I pray that we would continue in a heart of worship as we open your word, and Lord, we ask that you would speak to us and that we would hear clearly, and Lord, that we would receive what you have for us tonight. We ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, with chapter 13 of Judges, we open up to a familiar character. And I say a familiar character instead of a familiar story. Because the truth is if the only way that you know Samson is by sometime in your past hearing about him in Sunday school, then you probably don't know Samson. Because Samson in our Sunday school lessons was made into something that he really wasn't. And some of what he was left out. And so if you've never heard about Samson other than those Sunday school stories, you might be surprised by what you hear tonight. My desire is to move through his entire story, but that's quite a bit of chapters, but we'll see, because we'll just see what the Lord does. You know, one of the things I wanted to have us look for as we consider this man Samson is he's sort of a overview of the entire book of Judges. His life really reflects the ups and downs of the entire nation of Israel through this entire period of time that we've been studying. And I'll remind you that this book covers about 400 years. So we've been through quite a few time as we've gone this distance. And it's been some time, even since chapter 12 becoming chapter 13, as you'll see when we open the story. But you could take this study of Samson and really lay it over the entirety of the Bible and really see everything from man's first sin all the way to the penalty of revelation. So that there's a great theme being played out here in this one single story. And again, if all you've ever heard is a Sunday school story, that may have sounded shocking on its own. But no surprise how the chapter begins. Verse 1. And again, the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord delivered them into the hand of the Philistines for 40 years. A couple things to consider in that opening verse. One, the good news in this book, you'll never hear those words again. So we can applaud that. This is the last time that we see this pattern repeat itself. And for this book, it'll be the last judge that we see in the book of Judges, Samson. We won't see another judge until we come to Samuel sometime later. This is the 7th time that we've heard that these people did evil in the sight of the Lord. Every time we see the number 7 in Scripture, we need to take notice of it. It's God's perfect number, his divine number. However he was working things out through this nation and their disobedience, it was the perfect amount of times that this would happen. And it seems odd to look at something like disobedience and say that was the perfect amount of times that it would happen. But God uses our disobedience. God will use whatever we present him because his plan won't be spoiled. And we notice that they were given into the hand of the Philistines for 40 years. 40 years is also now the longest period that we see in all of the book of Judges, that they were turned over to their sin, the captivity of another nation. And one of the other things that really separates this particular 7th time of this pattern is that what we won't see is the people recognizing their condition. We don't see the people coming to an end of themselves and crying out to the Lord and wanting to repent and have God save them. This time God has a purpose in this one man's life, and he intercedes in a family's life to bring this one man's life about for his purposes without them ever really asking to be brought out of it, like we've seen in other cases. We might wonder why. After 40 years, the longest period that we've seen now, they're not crying out. They're not asking to be relieved of their captivity or the lifestyle that they're in, or even a recognition of their sin. And really, all I can surmise, and it's an assumption on my part, is they became very comfortable being under the Philistines. Now, the Philistines were a brutal lot, but also their religion was one of sensuality. It was one of sexual immorality. And that may have actually been something that enticed the men of Israel to stay exactly where they were at. We won't know. We don't know. But it's interesting how this particular character is laid out for us. The entirety of chapter 13, a very important introduction to who Samson is and the way by which God intervenes in this family's life to bring this one man into a place where he needs him to be. So it's verse 2 says, "Now there was a certain man from Zorah of the family of the Danites, whose name was Manoah, and his wife was barren and had no children." So we meet a man, Manoah. We meet his wife, unnamed. They're Danites, which means they're from the tribe of Dan. And remember, this is 40 years into a setting of ungodliness. And yet God comes into the midst of a family that we're going to find out has not forgotten God. Has not forgotten the God of creation, the true God, amongst all the gods of the Philistines. And how often have we seen God step into a setting where he's remembered to use those people? I think there's a great message of hope in this chapter here about families who strive to do the right thing with their children. Strive to do, in the midst of all the difficulties of this world, to do what God's asked them to do, even though it's unpopular, even though it doesn't seem maybe for those, and maybe some of us can testify to the same, like it's mattering much. And yet I think it's an encouragement in this chapter to press on to the right things to do with our families. But his wife was barren and had no children. That's another recurring theme throughout Scripture. We saw it with Sarah, who was actually Sarai at the time, wife of Abraham, who was barren, and God stepped in and had a plan to bring a child to a couple that could not conceive. We saw it with John the Baptist, who we could draw some parallels with Samson as we go forward. But she was also barren without a child, and God brought about that birth of John, the cousin of Jesus. And so not an unfamiliar tactic of the Lord. And we see just how direct this interaction is, and this intercession is, and this intervention is of the Lord in the very next verse, verse 3. "And the angel of the Lord appeared to the woman and said to her, 'Indeed, now you are barren and have borne no children, but you shall conceive and bear a son. Now therefore please be careful not to drink wine or similar drink, and not to eat anything unclean. For behold, you shall conceive and bear a son, and no razor shall come upon his head, for the child shall be a Nazarite to God from the womb, and he shall begin to deliver Israel out of the hand of the Philistines.'" So we see that is the angel. You'll notice it's the angel, capital A, of the Lord. Angel simply meaning messenger. Not an angel, small a. Not one of those supernatural creations of the Lord, an angel, but the angel, which speaks for a pre-incarnate visitation of the Lord himself into the life of this family. How important was it to him that he would step into time physically before them to bring this message and an instruction? The mother is told that this child will be a Nazarite. Now we're told over in Numbers chapter 6 verse 2 that there was this Nazarite vow that would be taken by a person, voluntary of that person, to set themselves aside, consecrate themselves for a period of time to be used of the Lord for whatever purpose. And amongst the things if that Nazarite vow would require is that they would not cut their hair the entire time. Once the Nazarite vow come to a conclusion, they would cut it. They would actually offer the hair as part of a burnt offering. They would have nothing to do with anything from the grape plant. They couldn't have the seed, the skin, the fruit, the wine, the juice, nothing. Why it's to that extent I can't explain, but it is. They were to have nothing to do with anything that was dead. And so we see something different here. One, in a sense, this isn't voluntary. Jesus has stepped into the scene and has told this mother, you're going to have this son. You will set him aside, consecrate him for this Nazarite vow, and you will do it from this time of conception for the entirety of his life. And it's so great a commitment that it's not only the child, but it begins at moment of conception, and the mother has a responsibility to make sure that that child in its ways are also consecrated. What a perfect timing for this picture as we come to this place in our nation right now where amazingly we're wrestling with late-term abortion, with post-birth abortion, and sorry, I don't really want to use that word, it's infanticide. It's the killing of a child after birth. And here is just one place in God's word where he points to the life of a child in the womb from the very beginning and makes it a life. A life that's to be consecrated, set apart, and taken care of by all the things that go with this vow. And notice that it says there, the end of verse 5, the child shall be a Nazirite to God from the womb, and he shall begin to deliver Israel out of the hand of the Philistines. That says to me that he was not to complete it. This was a task that he would have some time in and effort upon and some influence over, but he would not complete the task. Verse 6, so the woman came and told her husband, saying, a man of God came to me, and his countenance was like the countenance of the angel of God, very awesome. But I did not ask him where he was from, and he did not tell me his name. And he said to me, behold, you shall conceive and bear a son. Now drink no wine or similar drink, nor eat anything unclean, for the child shall be a Nazirite to God from the womb to the day of his death. From the womb to the tomb. This child would be set apart, and the mother had a place in that. She tells her husband, you can tell from the wording, she doesn't not yet know who this was. It says it was a man of God came to me. His countenance was like the countenance of the angel of God. So maybe she considered him just an angel of God. But they'll soon know for sure who this is. Verse 8, then Manoah prayed to the Lord and said, O my Lord, please let the man of God, whom you sent to come to us again and teach us what we shall do for the child who will be born. And God listened to the voice of Manoah, and the angel of God came to the woman again, and she was sitting in the field, but Manoah, her husband, was not with her. Then the woman ran in haste and took her husband and said to him, look, the man who came to me the other day has just now appeared to me. So Manoah arose and followed his wife. When he came to the man, he said to him, are you the man who spoke to this woman? And he said, I am. Manoah said, now let your words come to pass. What will be the boy's rule of life and his work? So the angel of the Lord said to Manoah, of all that I said to the woman, let her be careful. She may not eat anything that comes from the vine, nor may she drink wine or similar drink, nor eat anything unclean. All that I command her, let her observe. And so they have that second visitation. We see this great response of Manoah, the husband, who prays to the Lord. After 40 years, had not forgotten who the Lord is, asked this request that this man would come again. And God honored that because it was God that was coming in the flesh to visit with them. And then Manoah asked, is this you spoke to this woman? He said, I have. But look how he answers. Always we need to notice when he says these words, I am. I am, identifying exactly the name that he gave Moses. I am that I am. And then Manoah says, let your words come to pass. And then he asked a very interesting question, and it's a question that every parent should ask and continue to ask. Every grandparent, I believe, could continue to ask. And that is of, what will the boy or girl, if that's the case for you, what will the boy's rule of life? What will be the boy's rule of life and his work? What a great question for the Lord about a child. What do you have for this child? What are you releasing them? You gave that child to us. A precious gift. And now what plan do you have for that child? Because we know that he has a plan for every life. And then it's interesting because Jesus never really answers that question. He just repeats what he had told the wife before, that she needs to be careful. And then he delineates some of that caution. Verse 15, then Manoah said to the angel of the Lord, please let us detain you, and we will prepare a young goat for you. And the angel of the Lord said to Manoah, though you detain me, I will not eat your food. But if you offer a burnt offering, you must offer it to the Lord. For Manoah did not know he was the angel of the Lord. Then Manoah said to the angel of the Lord, what is your name, that when your words come to pass, we may honor you? And the angel of the Lord said to him, why do you ask my name, seeing it is wonderful? And so some commentators interestingly think this was an attempt on Manoah's part to manipulate this man, to keep him there. I don't see that, because this is the habit of this culture. We see Abraham want to keep those that visit him, the angels. We see Lot, he wanted to keep those visitors there. And here likewise, it's just part of their culture to always give their best to a guest. But he tells him, I won't eat your food, but if you're going to do a burnt offering, then do it to the Lord. And he could have said it in the sense, make that sacrifice to me. And then he says, what is your name? And Manoah asked him, what is his name? And the angel of the Lord said, why do you ask my name? I think that's just an interesting question. And then he says, seeing that it is wonderful, as if to say it is too wonderful for me to even tell you my name. But I find that interesting too, that he says it's wonderful, because over in Isaiah chapter 9, verse 6, we have the prophecy of Jesus being born. And it says, for unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given, and the government will be upon his shoulder, and his name will be called Wonderful. And it goes on, of course, Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Verse 19, so Manoah took the young goat with the grain offering, offered upon the rock to the Lord, and he did a wondrous thing while Manoah and his wife looked on. It happened as the flame went up toward heaven from the altar, the angel of the Lord ascended in the flame of the altar. When Manoah and his wife saw this, they fell on their faces to the ground. I bet they did. When the angel of the Lord appeared no more to Manoah and his wife, then Manoah knew that he was the angel of the Lord. And Manoah said to his wife, we shall surely die, because we have seen God. I love that. To jump to that conclusion, to be that much in awe of the experience that they just had, to have seen, I mean, it must have been like the apostles there when Jesus ascended back into heaven. They stood and looked, but only for a moment, until they ended up flat on their face. And then Manoah was a little bit panicked. We're not to see God. We must be about to die. And then his wife said, in a wifely way, you silly man. Verse 23, but his wife said to him, if the Lord had desired to kill us, he would not have accepted a burnt offering and a grain offering from our hands. Nor would he have shown us all these things, nor would he have told us such things as these at this time. So the woman bore a son and called his name Samson. And the child grew, and the Lord blessed him. And the Spirit of the Lord began to move upon him in Mahane-dan, between Zorah and Eshtaol. Now, that place that they were at was just called the Camp of Dan. Called his name Samson, which means little sun. Can also just mean bright, bright as the sun. And it says that the Lord, via his Spirit, began to move upon him, prepare him. It also tells us there at the end of verse 24 that the Lord blessed him. We don't know exactly what all those blessings were. To have the Spirit of the Lord upon you is a blessing. To have been called from the time of the womb forward for a purpose is a blessing. And the Lord blesses those that he calls. Now, with all that as the introduction to this man's life, wouldn't you expect it to be a wonderful story? Wouldn't you expect it to be nothing but a display of obedience and love for the Lord? And again, I think this is hope. And it's kind of an odd hope. You'll have to bear with me. A hope that as parents, as grandparents, all we can do is our best. And as long as we've done our best, we should have some relief in that. There should be some grace in that we've done our best. And our best will include a list of all the mistakes that we've made. But if we've done our best, then we've raised a child that has a choice to make, to follow our best or to go a different direction. And we've seen, and I'm going to term it this way a little bit strong, we've seen bad kids happen to good parents. I can testify to that. Not perfect parents, but good parents. And so I just want to bring that as an encouragement for parents. You do the best you can. And then a child will reach an age where they will make decisions on their own. And that's when the prayer life really kicks in. Not that you're not supposed to pray before that point. But this is an interesting man, Samson. And if I had to find a scripture to give us a preview of Samson, then I would jump all the way over to the very practical book of James. And I would read to you this verse or chapter 1, verse 8. He is a double-minded man, unstable in all his ways. That's how I would sum up Samson. That's how I would sum up a lot of the characters and the people in general that we've seen through this book. This is how I would sum up, well, us, and a lot of the times, that we are double-minded too often. We try our best to stay in a single lane, but we're distracted and we're tempted and we're pulled away. But Samson, I think Samson, as well as his spiritual gifting, was given some acumen of intelligence. That's a guess on my part. I think this guy was pretty intelligent. I think he was an artist of the word and just a little bit too much of a boy, never reaching manhood. Let's jump into some of his story. Now Samson went down to Timnah and saw a woman in Timnah of the daughters of the Philistines. So he went up and told his father and mother, saying, I have seen a woman in Timnah of the daughters of the Philistines. Now therefore get her for me as a wife. Then his father and mother said to him, Is there no woman among the daughters of your brethren, or among all my people, that you must go and get a wife from the uncircumcised Philistines? And Samson said to his father, Get her for me, for she pleases me well. I don't know if you've ever seen a family where the child rules the roost. We seem to be in a time in our culture where that is more often the case. But here it seems that there was a little bit too much of this young man's influence over his parents. We don't know his age. But he went where he shouldn't have been, and I say that really not knowing why he was there to begin with. And we need to really take heed of what he said in verse 2, I have seen a woman. And then down at the end of verse 3, he said, she pleases me well. And the language there really means that she is good to my eye. And see, that's a pattern that we see from the garden forward. Because we see that thing that took place in the garden was a pattern of the lust of the eye, followed by the lust of the flesh, and then followed by the pride of life. And that is the exact pattern we will see with Samson. It's the pattern we've seen with the Israeli people. It's the pattern we see really with all people, with all sin. He saw something that pleased him. It was desired of his flesh. And then it became about what he wanted for him. Verse 4, but his father and mother did not know that it was of the Lord. Wait a minute. How could that be of the Lord? I mean, the Lord is the one, is he not, that told this people never to marry into the other cultures. This Jewish mom and dad were trying to keep it in the family. They were trying to keep it in their own people. Maybe keeping in the family was the wrong words. Keeping in their own people. But now here we find out the father and mother did not know this was of the Lord. So did God now approve of what Samson was doing? No. But God knew that he could use what Samson was doing to bring about the purposes that he had planned. As I always say, we can certainly mess up our lives, but we can't mess up God's plan. He will do what he sets his mind to do. And he will use whatever we do to get it done. But his father and mother did not know this was of the Lord, that he was seeking an occasion to move against the Philistines. For at that time the Philistines had dominion over Israel. Remember, Israel belongs to God. Israel is the apple of God's eye. Israel is the people amongst all peoples that God called out as his own. And he turned all other people over to angelic influence. And remember, this is not a people that asked for this. This is a people this is being put upon by God himself. Verse 5, so Samson went down to Timnah with his father and mother and came to the vineyards of Timnah. Now to his surprise, a young lion came roaring against him. Real quick here, as you see this, I don't know why, but his parents and him are traveling separate. There's a distance because his parents aren't seeing what's now unfolding. Just wanted to get that in the context. Verse 6, and the Spirit of the Lord came mightily upon him, and he tore the lion apart as one would have torn apart a young goat, though he had nothing in his hand. But he did not tell his father or his mother what he had done. Then he went down and talked with the woman, and she pleased Samson well. So they're traveling separately. This lion comes out of nowhere. And see, we start to get in the popular telling of Samson's story, this image of this powerful human being. You know, Arnold Schwarzenegger for the purposes of God's plan. And yet, why was he able to do what he did? Because the power of the Lord, the Spirit of the Lord came upon him. Why? To make him puffed up and believe in his own power? No, to protect him because God needed him. It's as simple as that. He just needed him. He needed to keep him alive. In order to keep him alive, he had to give him the power to overcome this lion. Now, we have to also picture something else is going on here because things move way too fast for them not to have happened. The father and the mother had gone on before him, I believe, and they had already started the process with the parents of the woman that Samson was interested in, the dowry, all the things that would have had to been done, the agreement. Otherwise, the story moves way too fast if we don't assume that. Because he went down, verse 7, and talked with the woman, and she pleased Samson well. Verse 8, after some time when he returned to get her, he turned aside to see the carcass of the lion. So he's left and he's coming back. For some reason, he's curious about the lion he's killed. Maybe he's amazed because he does know himself. And he is no Arnold Schwarzenegger. And he wants to go back and see where this amazing thing took place. And behold, a swarm of bees and honey were in the carcass of the lion. He took some of it in his hand and went along eating. When he came to his father and mother, he gave some to them, and they also ate. But he did not tell them that he had taken the honey out of the carcass of the lion. May I point out the dead lion? May I point out the unclean animal? May I point out the fact that he had just broken his vow and he had caused his parents to do the same? Pretty irresponsible. Pretty selfish. But he's feeding the eyes and he's feeding the flesh. And the pride of life is right there before him because it was about his own needs. Even to the exclusion of the covering his mother and father and their want to stay pure before the Lord. Verse 10, so his father went down to the woman, and Samson gave a feast there, for young men used to do so. And it happened when they saw him that they brought 30 companions to be with him. Then Samson said to them, let me pose a riddle to you. If you can correctly solve and explain it to me within the 7 days of the feast, then I will give you 30 linen garments and 30 changes of clothing. But if you cannot explain it to me, then you shall give me 30 linen garments and 30 changes of clothing. And they said to him, pose your riddle that we may hear it. So he said to them, out of the eater came something to eat, and out of the strong came something sweet. Now for 3 days they could not explain the riddle. One of the things, if we're looking, we'll notice about Samson, not only was he selfish, not only was he, and it will be further seen as we go forward, kind of hard to get along with. Not only did he seem, at least in my interpretation, have kind of a arrogance about him, but he didn't have any friends. So much so that they had to give him 30 friends from the people in the location of where his wedding feast was taking place. And so he decided, out of his arrogance and maybe his intelligence, to mess with these people, to give them a riddle, to offer them a gift in response to this successful response to the riddle, but at a cost if they could not. And this may seem like a really strange bet, but you know, how many changes of clothes do you think they had? Probably the pair they had on. They'd probably have to go wash it, put it on, and let it dry on the body. So here was, and the linen speaks of underwear. So here's a full wardrobe, one day's wardrobe, being offered to all 30 of these men, or a month's wardrobe offered back to Samson if they couldn't get the riddle right. He really pushed them, we're going to see. Verse 15, but it came to pass on the seventh day that they said to Samson's wife, now it doesn't seem that they ever really got married, and we'll see that here in a moment, but I guess in a sense the dowry was already taken care of, the feast was already on its way, that in some sense, although they haven't consummated the marriage, that they are still considered husband and wife. So they said to Samson's wife, entice your husband that he may explain the riddle to us, or else we will burn you and your father's house with fire. Have you invited us in order to take what is ours? Is that not so? Don't play Trivial Pursuit with these people. Verse 16, then Samson's wife wept on him and said, you only hate me. You do not love me. You have posed a riddle to the sons of my people, but you have not explained it to me. And he said to her, look, I have not explained it to my father and mother, so should I explain it to you? Now she had wept on him the 7 days while their feast lasted. And it happened on the seventh day that he told her, because she pressed him so much. Then she explained the riddle to the sons of the people. So the men of the city said to him on the seventh day, before the sun went down. So let's pause there for a second. What a wonderful feast, that these men would seek to do such an evil thing just for the answer of the riddle. And that's such a wonderful feast that for 7 days Samson got to experience his wife to be, or his new wife if you want to see it that way, crying for 7 days. Crying for 7 days. I would have went and gave the answer. For 7 days. And so the men of the city come to him in verse 18 on the seventh day before the sun went down. What is sweeter than honey and what is stronger than a lion? So they gave the answer and they knew it because they had taken it from his wife. And Samson replies, if you had not plowed with my heifer, you would have not solved my riddle. Not a good beginning to a marriage. That he would cause her to cry for 7 days, to have her and her father threatened to be burned alive, and then to have been called a heifer by her husband. Now, not only is that kind of cruel, but we also need to read into that. I would guess that that was some sort of idiom, some sort of saying maybe in their culture. I don't know, maybe Samson was that clever to come up with something that quick. He seems to be clever. But what we can read into that is the fact is the heifer was never used to plow. So in a sense, they used his wife for something that she was not intended to be used for, and that is coming against her husband. So I see there being more than just the insult there to compare his wife to a heifer. Verse 19, then the Spirit of the Lord came upon him mightily, and he went down upon him mightily, and Then the Spirit of the Lord came upon him mightily, and he went down to Ashkelon and killed 30 of their men, took their apparel, and gave the changes of clothing to those who had explained the riddle. So his anger was aroused, and he went back up to his father's house, and Samson's wife was given to his companion, who had been his best man. What an ending to a week. Now the Spirit comes upon him, and he goes and he kills 30. There's a little bit of a mystery there. Was that what God intended him to do? Was that just some ways so Samson can have an outlet and not kill the 30 men that are standing before him that are family of his, what was his wife? We don't know for sure, but he definitely took out his anger. He kept up his part of the deal, no matter how bad it seems to have gone. And what we see here is that the marriage was not consummated because they didn't have their union there at the end of the week. And I guess that was stark of enough of event for the father of the bride, the father of the wife, if you want to consider it that way, thought, he's not coming back. It was kind of a weird assumption on his part. And so he gives her to the best man. story gets better and better. Verse 1, chapter 15. After a while, in the time of wheat harvest, it happened that Samson visited his wife with a young goat. So he still considers her his wife. And he said, "Let me go into my wife, into her room." But her father would not permit him to go in. Her father said, "I really thought that you thoroughly hated her. Therefore I gave her to your companion. Is not her younger sister better than she? Please take her instead." This poor woman. She had a week of tears, threat of murder, had to coerce her husband into giving up a secret. She's called a heifer in public. She's given to the best man from the wedding ceremony. And now her own father says, hey, her sister's better than she is. Verse 3, and Samson said to them, "This time I shall be blameless regarding the Philistines if I harm them." That's an interesting thing that Samson says there. Because I almost think for a moment he had clarity. And I think he was looking back for a moment and going, okay, I don't want to repeat what's happened. Because if I let this anger boil over, someone's going to die. And so he says, you know what, I'm not going to take their lives, but that doesn't mean he wasn't going to do anything. And here is where I think we see the boy in Samson that never became a man, the cleverness, the playfulness, the arrogance, the intelligence. Very interesting character, and the thing that he came up with to this day blows my mind. Verse 4, then Samson went and caught 300 foxes. Now, did he catch 300 foxes? Some people have trouble with that thought. Well, one, it doesn't say he caught them all at once. But actually, your word foxes there is probably italicized, the foxes. That was put in by the scribes. There's a thought that it was actually jackals. Now, jackals would often herd together, and very often there could be 200 jackals in a herd. He may not have done it alone either, so we don't know how he gathered them. Nonetheless, God brings us this tale, no pun intended, that he caught 300 foxes or jackals, and he took torches, turned the foxes tail to tail, and put a torch between each pair of tails. When he had set the torches on fire, he let the foxes go into the standing grain of the Philistines and burned up both the shocks and the standing grain, as well as the vineyards and the olive groves. What a sight that must have been. These animals, tail to tail, the torch between them, one pulling one way until the other got the best of the other, turning every which way in the fields. Seems a little much. He would burn out their livelihood, all of their crops. We find out this is the time of the wheat, so they would have lost a lot in this entire thing. Verse 6, when the Philistines said, "Who has done this?" And they answered, "Samson, the son-in-law of the Timnite, because he has taken his wife and given her to his companion." So the Philistines came up and burned her and her father with fire. Didn't get any better. Samson said to them, since you would do a thing like this, I will surely take revenge on you, and after that I will cease. So he attacked them hip and thigh with a great slaughter. Then he went down and dwelt in the cleft of the rock of Edom. That term there, he attacked them with them hip and thigh. It just speaks of a very violent attack. And it must have been very great amongst the Philistines, because we're going to see in a moment what the men of Judah thought they had to assemble in order to deal with this man Samson, who went where? To dwell in the cleft of the rock of Edom. He had no other place to go, no home at this point. Verse 9, now the Philistines went up, encamped in Judah, and deployed themselves against Lehi. And the men of Judah said, "Why have you come up against us?" So they answered, "We have come up to arrest Samson, to do to him as he has done to us." So what is Judah's response? Verse 11, then 3,000 men. That tells me what he did to Philistines. If Judah thinks they need 3,000 men now to go talk to Samson. 3,000 men of Judah went down to the cleft of the rock of Edom and said to Samson, "Do you not know that the Philistines rule over us? What is this you have done to us?" And he said to them, "As they did to me, so I have done to them." But they said to him, "We have come down to arrest you, that we may deliver you into the hand of the Philistines." Then Samson said to them, "Swear to me that you will not kill me yourselves." So they spoke to him, saying, "No, but we will tie you securely and deliver you into their hand, but we will surely not kill you." And they bound him up with 2 new ropes and brought him up from the rock. So it took 3,000, it seems, to give them confidence enough to arrest this man. And you can see there in their language, kind of what we talked about at the beginning, they really had no desire to get out from underneath the Philistines. That's why God, I believe, intervened directly to move this chapter of their lives ahead, because they weren't going to get out of it on their own. And remember, in the Bible, 40 is the amount of years they were in the Philistines, and 40 is a number of judgment. And so whatever God was doing with them, we can really draw a conclusion from the number of 40 that they had been judged, and now it was time for God to judge those people, the Philistines. Verse 14, when he came to Lehi, the Philistines came shouting against him. Then the Spirit of the Lord came mightily upon him, and the ropes that were on his arms became like flax that is burned with fire, and his bonds broke loose from his hands. He found the fresh jawbone of a donkey, reached out his hand, took it, and killed 1,000 men with it. Then Samson said, "With the jawbone of a donkey, heads upon heaps, with the jawbone of a donkey I have slain 1,000 men." And so it was, when he had finished speaking, that he threw the jawbone from his hand and called that place Ramath Lehi, which means jawbone height. Where do you live? Oh, up at Jawbone Height. And so their arrest, the method of their arrest, didn't last very long. And he breaks his bonds, he grabs a jawbone of a donkey, and he kills 1,000 men. It's interesting, I was reading some old-time commentators, and they really played with this. I was surprised, because King James, I believe, says the jawbone of an ass. And these old-time commentators were playing on that, saying that he assassinated. And another one was talking about how he assailed his assailants. And it was interesting, just didn't expect that from a couple hundred years ago. Some of you know who Chuck Smith is. Chuck Smith founded Calvary Chapel, which was the movement that I came out of. And when they used to do big pastor conferences down in Murrieta, California, Chuck would always be there. And there'd be 1,000+ pastors from all over the world in that conference for a week. And at lunchtime, it was amazing how they were able to do it. They'd bring almost 1,000 men into this cafeteria area and get us all fed wonderfully. The staff was amazing. But Chuck would always be there somewhere up towards the head table. It was an L-shaped room. You really couldn't see around to Chuck's table from around the corner, but you could hear him. And he'd usually pray us into lunch or into dinner, into breakfast if he was there. And he was about 80, about the time I'm thinking of this particular story, maybe his late 70s. He died when he was 83. But one time he was praying this, I think it was into lunch. And I always remember, because I was close enough my table to see him. And he reaches on the table and he picks up this thing, and I'm like looking, it looked like a boomerang from where I was standing. And he goes, he had a deep voice, I can't do it, but he says, "This is the jawbone of an ass." And he said, once Samson used this jawbone to kill 1,000 men. And he said, don't use yours to kill any of your people. That was a message to pastors. It actually took me a moment to get what he said. Sat down, I was like, what? It's like, oh. And then everybody at the table was waking up at the same time going, did he see? Yep, that's what he said. Verse 18, another showing of Samson's character. Then he became very thirsty, so he cried out to the Lord and said, "You have given this great deliverance by the hand of your servant, and now shall I die of thirst and fall into the hand of the uncircumcised?" So God split the hollow place that is in Lehi, and water came out, and he drank. And his spirit returned, and he revived. Therefore he called its name En-Hakkore, which is in Lehi to this day. And he judged Israel 20 years. 20 years in the days of the Philistines. So Samson is allowed to become their judge for 20 years, even with all of this that had transpired. He does, at least in verse 18, notice who gave him this great victory. You have given this great deliverance by the hand of your servant. But then he kind of goes into another arrogant sort of prayer, asking for the sustenance of water, which I'm sure after killing 1,000 men with a jawbone that he was thirsty. And his spirit returned. He was revived after he got the water. Let's press on a bit more. Chapter 16, verse 1. Now Samson went to Gaza and saw a harlot there and went into her. When the Gazites were told, Samson has come here, they surrounded the place and lay in wait for him all night at the gate of the city. They were quiet all night, saying, in the morning, when it is daylight, he will kill him. And Samson lay low till midnight, and he arose at midnight, took hold of the doors of the gate of the city and the 2 gateposts, pulled them up, bar and all, put them on his shoulders, and carried them to the top of the hill that faces Hebron. So no sooner does he have this great battle won, no sooner does he give glory to the Lord and rewarded with some water, no sooner is he given the judgeship for 20 years that he ends up in Gaza and he ends up going into a harlot and he sins again. And you know, in particular, this sexual sin, you know, my heart's been broken over the years to see how many men, how many brothers in the pulpit have fallen to this one. I mean, just in the last few years, I mean, brothers that I never would have guessed. Brothers that I've sat under their teaching, I've been under their leadership at conferences and different things, and then a year later, and I don't stand here with any surprise, because human nature is what it is, and sin is what it is, and flesh is what it is. It doesn't forgive it, but it's always a place where any man, any woman in the service of the Lord needs to be on their game, needs to be prayed up, needs accountability, needs covering. It's a dangerous place to be alone in ministry, or to think that you can do it without a temptation. So now they're told that he's there, and they surround the place and they lay await all night at the gate. And remember, the gate of a city was the place of politics. It was the place the men of the city, the elders of the city, made decisions, where the government went on. So they lay there, one, because it's a place where those things are done, but it's where he would have to exit out. But Samson comes down. I would love to have seen this one. And he basically doesn't go through the gate. He takes the gate, all of it, which I imagine was a pretty big apparatus. And he carries it, it tells us, to the top of the hill that faces Hebron. Well, we know from the geographic area and the travel that he carried that gate about 40 miles to the top of the hill. And you know, if nothing else, we should marvel at the power of the Lord. Because so far, and I think it's going to be proven here in a moment, there's nothing about this man that would make us assume a great physical prowess, a great physical power, anything about him. Although when we see him drawn by others, he's always this muscle-bound guy. Nothing tells us that. As a matter of fact, I think you're going to see here in a moment that everything would possibly tell us the opposite. But with the power of the Lord upon him. Now, we usually think of the power of the Lord for spiritual things, but the Lord will bring upon us whatever we need to get done whatever he wants us to do. Verse 4, afterward it happened that he loved a woman in the valley of Sorek, whose name is Delilah. And the lords of the Philistines came up to her and said to her, entice him and find out where his great strength lies, and by what means we may overpower him, that we may bind him to afflict him. And every one of us will give you 1,100 pieces of silver. I read that verse several times, and I can't tell from the language Did that mean in total or each? I don't know. But 1,100 pieces of silver is about 140 pounds of silver. So I'm thinking just one giving would be enough, but I don't know. But do you notice the mystery? What can't they figure out? Where his strength's coming from? They didn't step back and say, well, look how he's built. Look how many hours he spends in the gym. Look what he eats. There was nothing about him that gave a clue as to why he should have this power. And so when I see the pictures of Samson, I think, maybe not. Maybe he wore skinny jeans. I don't know. But they were mystified as to where his power. But in this case, they weren't interested in power. They were interested in weakness. And they start with the weakness of this woman. And the weakness of this woman was not her love for Samson. It was for her love of money. And they're dealing with what the weakness of Samson is what they want her to find out. What is his weakness? Find out his power so we might know his weakness. Verse 6. So Delilah said to Samson, please tell me where your great strength lies, and with what you may be bound to afflict you. And Samson said to her, if they bind me with 7 fresh bowstrings, not yet dried, then I shall become weak and be like any other man. So the lords of the Philistines brought up to her 7 fresh bowstrings, not yet dried, and she bound him with them. Now men were lying in wait, staying with her in the room. And she said to him, the Philistines are upon you, Samson. But he broke the bowstrings as a strand of yarn breaks when it touches fire. So the secret of his strength was not known. Now you could forgive Samson once. That he's so smitten with her that he'll play along. He likes her. Give her a little information. See if she takes the bait. But she announces her very purpose. She has the men laying in wait. And if there was ever an example of blind love or maybe lust, this is it. Because we have to be surprised for the rest of this story, at least I am. Verse 10. Then Delilah said to Samson, look, you have mocked me and told me lies. Now please tell me what you may be bound with. So he said to her, if they bind me securely with new ropes that have never been used, then I shall become weak and be like other men. Therefore Delilah took new ropes and bound him with them and said to him, the Philistines were upon you, Samson. And men were laying in wait, staying in the room. But he broke them off his arms like a thread. Okay, fool me once. Fool me twice? Verse 13. Delilah said to Samson, until now you have mocked me and told me lies. Tell me what you may be bound with. And he said to her, if you weave the 7 locks of my head into the web of the loom. So she wove it tightly with the batten of the loom, and said to him, the Philistines are upon you, Samson. But he awoke from his sleep and pulled out the batten and the web from the loom. Now, notice how close he's getting to divulging a truth. To his own demise. Because he's blinded by lust. It started with his eyes, remember? And it became a matter of his flesh. And now the pride of life will cost him everything. Verse 15, then she said to him, how can you say I love you when your heart is not with me? You have mocked me these 3 times and have not told me where your great strength lies. And it came to pass when she pestered him daily with her words and pressed him so that his soul was vexed to death, that he told her all his heart and said to her, no razor has ever come upon my head, for I have been a Nazarite to God from my mother's womb. If I am shaven, then my strength will leave me, and I shall become weak and be like any other man. Now, was the power in his hair? No. But it was the last semblance of his vow. It is the only thing left of what his mother really took a stand to make happen. And it's the only thing that he had not yet undone of his vow. But it was the last thing, in a sense, the last straw. Verse 18, when Delilah saw that he had told her all his heart, she sent and called for the Lord of the Philistines, saying, "Come up once more, for he has told me all his heart." So the Lord of the Philistines came up to her and brought the money in they brought the money in their hand. Then she lulled him to sleep on her knees and called for a man and had him shave off the 7 locks of his head. Then she began to torment him, and his strength left him. And she said, "The Philistines are upon you, Samson." So he awoke from his sleep and said, "I will go out as before at other times and shake myself free." But he did not know that the Lord had departed from him. I think that's the saddest part of the story. That he didn't even know that the Lord had left him. That he was so sure of himself that he didn't realize that God had taken off his covering. That all his belief was in himself, that he would do again what he had done before. It's a sad thing to see in a person when they don't even realize that they've drifted from the Lord, that they think they're still okay with the Lord. You know, something that seems to be unique, maybe not, but I've seen it in the last decade or so, where you'll meet a person who has started to take their relationship with the Lord a bit too lightly, a bit too casually. And somebody I run into, and I kind of know where they've been at and what they kind of been doing, and I know they've kind of drifted and they're into this or they're into that. And you ask them and you say, "So how you doing?" And you know, and they say, "Well, you know, and you know, they know that you know where they're at in their life." And they start to say things like, "Well, you know, I've been, and maybe I haven't," and then they say this thing that gets me every time. "But the Lord knows my heart." To which I say, yes, he does. Yes, he does. Because there seems to be this thing where people think, but you know, the Lord knows that even though where I'm really at. And those two things contradict. One washes out the other. It's a game people play with themselves. Verse 21, then the Philistines took him and put out his eyes and brought him down to Gaza. They bound him with bronze fetters, and he became a grinder in the prison. However, the hair of his head began to grow again after it had been shaven. So the first thing they did was they gouged his eyes. They took away his sight, which almost seems justice by the Lord, because that's where it started. It started with his eyes, the lust of his eyes, and it just traveled from there to the lust of his flesh, to the pride of life, and ultimately it's his downfall. But God had a purpose in Samson's life, as he does with each one of us, and he's going to see it to its fruition. He brought up Samson from the time of the womb, and he'll take him all the way to the time of his tomb and fulfill what he intended to do, and that was to rid Israel of the Philistines. Now it's interesting because, again, a lot of old commentators, I noticed many of them had the same thing that they brought up. Seeing verse 21 and 22 is a picture of sin in general. And each one of them said this: in these two verses we see the binding, the blinding, and the grinding of sin. And so I couldn't say it better, so I just take it from what they said, because it really is a great description. It's what sin does. It binds us, it blinds us, it grinds us. So now we'll conclude the story. We did make it through. Verse 23, now the Lord of the Philistines gathered together to offer a great sacrifice to Dagon, their god. Remember the fish god? And to rejoice. And they said, our God has delivered into our hands Samson, our enemy. When the people saw him, they praised their God. For they said, our God has delivered into our hands our enemy, the destroyer of our land, and the one who multiplied our dead. So it happened when their hearts were merry, which means they were drunk, that they said, call for Samson, that he may perform for us. I don't know what type of performance they were calling for. So they called for Samson from the prison, and he performed for them. And they stationed him between the pillars. Now remember, his hair began to grow back. Again, the power wasn't in his hair, but I believe his confidence was. I believe that in In his blindness, he may have reached up a few times and remembered. We don't know how long he was imprisoned, how long his hair had gotten. But maybe that was a recall enough. Maybe he cried back out to the Lord. Maybe the Lord settled, and we believe so as we see this close. The Lord settled again upon him. And so maybe the performance was one of great strength. I don't know. And they stationed him, it tells us at the end of verse 25, between the pillars. Then Samson said to the lad who held him by the hand, "Let me feel the pillars which support the temple so that I can lean on them." Now the temple was full of men and women. All the lords of the Philistines were there. About 3,000 men and women on the roof watching while Samson performed. Then Samson called to the Lord, saying, "O Lord God, remember me, I pray. Strengthen me, I pray, just this once. O God, that I may with one blow take vengeance on the Philistines for my 2 eyes." And Samson took hold of the 2 middle pillars which support the temple, and he braced himself against them, one on his right, one and the other on his left. Then Samson said, "Let me die with the Philistines." And he pushed with all his might, and the temple fell on the lords of all the people who were within it. So the dead that he killed at his death were more than he had killed in his life. And his brothers and all his father's household came down and took him, and brought him up and buried him between Zorah and Eshtaol in the tomb of his father Manoah. He had judged Israel 20 years. And where do we find Samson? Hebrews chapter 11, the hall of faith. As disobedient, as messed up as he was, he still fulfilled the purposes of the Lord. He still was faithful in his own way, in his own weakness. And again, it's one of those stories that gives us hope. Not that we should sin and get away with it, not that we should sin and be used, but hope in the fact that God knows our weaknesses. And where we're weak, he is strong. And that's the whole purpose of his grace, is to do what we can't, to step in where we're weak, to fill in those low valleys and make them level. So that's our last judge of the book of Judges, and some other things we'll cover in the final chapters probably next week. A lot of lessons in that. I just ask that you'd contemplate, maybe meditate upon that story. There's a lot there, a lot going on. We'll rest there for tonight.